Sorry, technical fun. I'm going to stick this here. Okay. I should give a content warning up front here. The only code contained in this talk is written in BASIC, so you have been warned. So these days I'm mostly known for my calculator app, P Calc. I think it's fair to say I'm also known for the P Calc About screen. It kind of got away from me a few years back. So you can drop like hundreds of bananas, you can drive a car on a stunt course, you can collect bananas, hit a football, there's a lighthouse, there's a castle, you can drive the transmit truck, there's a helicopter. Yeah, it's kind of a bit hard to justify. You're probably wondering how I got into this situation. To explain first, I need to take us all back to the 1980s, before some of you, I suspect, were even born. This is going to take a while to load from tape, so I hope you're all patient. Yeah, well, that's much better. So there are two things that have always been closely linked together: the credits for who wrote a piece of software and hidden pieces of code, or Easter eggs. The most famous example of this is the game Adventure on the Atari 2600, written by Warren Robinett and released in 1980. You may have seen it referenced in Ernest Cline's Ready Player One. At the time, Atari didn't want to give any named credit to the programmers behind their games, as they thought competitors would lure them away. So everything was just credited to Atari. According to Warren, who was 26 years old when he single-handedly wrote Adventure, even for a very successful game, there was no royalty, no bonus, no pat on the back, not even a pizza. So, inspired by secret messages said to be hidden in Beatles records, Warren hid his own name deep inside the game in a room that was extremely hard to find. He handed the final code for Adventure over to Atari, and he promptly quit his job. It's slightly hard to read there, but that says vertically created by Warren Robinett. He said, "They had the power to keep my name off the box, but I had the power to put it on the screen." When it was finally discovered, Atari were rather unimpressed, to say the least, and wanted it to be removed, but the game was already released and burned onto many thousands of cartridges, and it ultimately sold over 1 million copies. Steve Wright, who was in charge of software development at Atari's consumer division at the time, argued for keeping it, saying that looking for these secret messages was like hunting around for hidden Easter eggs. They were good for business, as it gave players something else to do in their games. So they would put one in every game going forward, and thus this new meaning of the phrase Easter eggs was born. I was always fascinated by seeing the names of the people who created the software I used. And let's face it, in the early 80s, when I was about 10, by software I meant computer games. For example, who was this mysterious Jeff Minter guy who wrote all these weird British games I liked about sheep and camels for the Commodore 64? In the scrolling credits here, he says that he wrote this whole game himself in 2 months. And he was pretty much my main inspiration to start programming in the first place, knowing that a single person made this thing that I really liked. But he was a mystery. These days, of course, I can literally watch him feed his sheep in a field in Wales live on the internet. As an aside, the biggest influence on P Calc's About screen was the game Action Biker from 1985, also for the Commodore 64. You drove a vehicle around a little city, performing stunts and collecting things. And I've tried for years to find out who actually wrote the game, with no success, as it was only ever credited to the publisher, Mastertronic. The name of the actual developer is seemingly now lost to time, and that's kind of what this is all about. Apple products have always had a bit of a history with Easter eggs and hidden credits. The original Macintosh had the signatures of the team who worked on it etched inside the case. Now, I did find out Steve Jobs' opinion of Easter eggs and about screens, but I'll come back to that later. But there was another Steve I could ask about this. So I talked to Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak, and he said, I wasn't directly involved in what became known as Easter eggs at Apple, but I did create an Easter egg of my own before Apple. I brought the Apple II prototype to the Homebrew Computing Club to show off a huge step in arcade games. I showed off the game of Breakout in color, written in BASIC. In my demo version, I could secretly hit Control-Z, and the paddle would never miss the ball, but would constantly jitter to look like it was accidental. I had John Draper, known as Captain Crunch of Blue Box fame, play Breakout on this machine. I don't think John had even played Pong, so he wasn't sure he could play it, but everyone watched and thought he was really playing the game, and he even beat it. Now, I checked the source code of his BASIC version, and it doesn't have the Easter egg, sadly, but it's only 34 lines of code for that whole game. As an aside, the two Steves have something of a history with Breakout. While Jobs was working for Atari in 1975, he was given the task of designing a prototype circuit board for the arcade game by founder Nolan Bushnell. Jobs didn't really have the necessary hardware skills, so he asked his good friend Woz for help. Woz did the design, Jobs built the board, and they split the $700 payment equally. What Jobs failed to mention was the additional $5,000 bonus for meeting the deadline, which he kept for himself. Woz only found out about that years later and was not happy. Jobs was about 20 at this point, Woz was 25. Anyway, fast forward to 1991, and I got my very first Mac, a Mac Classic. It originally came with System 6. And the earliest Easter egg that I was really aware of was related to the About the Finder window. Who were Larry, John, Steve, and Bruce? I didn't know, but to an 18-year-old Mac developer, they were my John, Paul, George, and Ringo. I'd always assumed that Steve was Steve Jobs for some reason, though. But I did want to see my name in there, even back then. By the time System 7 came out, the names were gone. But there was a small trick I found to see even more names. If you held down the Option key, the About This Macintosh menu item changed to About the Finder, and you got this screen. And if you waited a little bit more, you got a scrolling list of credits that, for the Finder team that went all the way back to the Lisa in 1981. I didn't even know what a Lisa was at this point, but it was all fascinating to me. And I finally got last names for Larry Kenyon, John Mayer, Steve Capps, and Bruce Horn. The image itself is supposed to be a stylized representation of Silicon Valley and had briefly appeared in System 1.1 in 1984. But there was intended to be a further Easter egg in System 7, which just didn't make it. It was a pan out to show that the valley was actually just part of some kind of dog/cow thing. I should give some background. Clarice the dog cow is a very special creature with her own deep lore and a history of appearing in Apple Easter eggs that could fill another talk entirely. She was originally drawn by Susan Kerr as part of the Cairo font on the Mac in 1983, and then redrawn by Annette Wagner for the LaserWriter page setup dialogue in 1986. Suffice to say, she's half dog, half cow, goes, and is strictly two-dimensional. She's also a lot taller than she looks. I'm about 12 pixels high there, to her 22. Note that this is the Susan Kerr original, which is slightly more dog-like, which you can tell by the shape of the snout. Clarice was part of the Icon Garden that was outside Apple's Infinite Loop headquarters in Cupertino from 1993 until 1998. Shortly after Steve Jobs came back to Apple as interim CEO, all the sculptures mysteriously disappeared overnight, along with all the colors in the Apple logo. To quote Steve, who was asked about it at a company meeting, "They weren't fun, they weren't cute, they're pixelated, and they're ugly." At WWDC in 2013, it was said that the sculptures were in the garage of a former Apple engineer after Steve Jobs had angrily offered them to him at the aforementioned company meeting. It turned out that this was a lie, or at least half a lie, because he had indeed been offered them at the meeting, but when he went to collect them, he was told that they had been destroyed. However, he subsequently heard that they were actually at Stanford University. So I reached out to the Special Collections and Archives Department at Stanford University, and they said no. So I wrote to Tim Cook. And, well, so far he has not replied, but just imagine how awesome the end of this story would be if he had. Clara's did make a rare appearance at WWDC, though, in pin badge form. She was the mascot for Apple's Developer Technical Support Group for a long time, and so has a particular affinity for developers. For more information, search the Apple archives for TechNote 31, written 30 years ago by official Dogcow historian Mark Harlan. Anyway, one of my favorite secret about boxes came with the PowerPC machines in the mid-90s and System 752. To trigger it, you type the phrase secret about box into any app and drag that text to the desktop. Now, a real-time 3D animated flag was pretty cool in 1995, let me tell you. You could change the wind direction just by moving the mouse around. It was based on flag simulation code originally written by Brandon Webb in 1987, and Alex Rosenberg, Steve Bollinger, and Greg Robbins built this about box with art from Bill Coder and Debbie Levinson. This picture of the development team was hidden in the ROM and could appear on the flag too. The name of the actual iguana was Herman, who you can just about make out at the bottom of this picture. And he lived in the cube of one of the OS engineers, Dave Evans. If he liked you, he would leap off the bookshelves onto your head. Herman, not Dave. And I am informed by people who sat nearby that iguanas smell pretty bad. There was actually a different egg in the earlier System 750, triggered in exactly the same way. A tribute, again, to the two Steves' history with Breakout. This code broke in System 751, and nobody had the time to get it running again, so it was removed. And this is a version of that code running on 753, so it's not strictly 100% authentic, but it doesn't matter. More messages could be found in the system file in the operating system if you looked at it with a text editor. In 7.0, it said, "Help, help, we're being held prisoner in a system software factory," with a list of credits. In System 7.5, it changed to, "Help, help, we're still being held prisoner in a system software factory." Later on, it finally read, "Mercenaries hit the software factory and freed all the prisoners." On the hardware side, a variety of images lurked in the ROMs of old Macs too. Here's a selection of product teams I found while searching through them. There's usually some specific way to view them, but it's trickier to demonstrate without the physical hardware. The big one was triggered by dragging the text secret ROM image to the desktop on a PCI Power Mac. In 1993, Gaston Bastiennes was general manager of the Newton division at Apple. His name is an anagram of Neat Bong Assist. And if you wrote Neat Bong, selected the text, and tapped the assist button, you got this list of developer names. There were many other Easter eggs on the Newton, some of which reportedly still survive today in the handwriting recognition code that got ported to the Mac. Sadly, they're going away in Catalina, so that will be the end of the Newton code base. By macOS 8, the Find a Secret About box had gained some slightly fancier 3D rendered mountains. But in 8.5 in 1998, there was a separate new full-screen About window, which you got by holding down Control-Option-Command and clicking the About menu. It just cycled through some of the groups that hadn't had a credit before, alongside random icons from your hard disk. As you could see there, this one was written by one Arno Gördel, who I'll come back to later. In macOS 9 in 1999, the Finder screen now had an actual photo of the Infinite Loop campus courtyard. It's actually the same background photo from the old iguana egg. Ever since I was a kid at university who first saw those scrolling credits, I really wanted to get my name in there. But, surprise twist, at this point in the story, I was actually working for Apple, and I was actually on the Finder team. You would think I'd have mentioned that at some point. I'd started working for Apple in late 1996 in Cork in Ireland. There were a number of development teams there based who were working on both hardware and software. My first project at Apple was actually working for Disney. Apple wanted some consumer software for the new Macintosh Performers that were coming out in 1997, and Cork ended up with the job of porting Disney's 101 Dalmatians print studio from Windows to the Mac. The idea was that you could design and print things like calendars, greetings cards, and certificates, and cover them liberally in Dalmatians. We rewrote it completely, and I worked on a lot of the user interface and graphics code. Despite an explicit clause in the Disney contract about there being no Easter eggs, let's just say there were a few. So, I've got a certificate here. I'm going to pick some artwork. Yeah, that looks quite nice. We'll go with that. See, I've localized this for Hacking with Swift. And I'm going to save this with the name moof, ! You may see where this is going. And I'll reopen it. And indeed, yes, there is now a Dalmatian cow. And this contravenes both Apple and Disney's contracts. And I could have got into a lot of trouble for that, but I didn't. I don't recommend doing that to Apple or Disney. This was the secret about box, which you got by saving a file with the project codename Modra, which is Irish for dog. Not the best picture of me there. But I also photoshopped my manager into this picture to make him complicit in the contract violation. I did get my name in the credits, but this was, on paper at least, a Disney product, not an Apple one. Many Mac apps of the time also had eggs in them. In Transmit 1, if you dragged a file called Secret About Box into the preview window, an alert popped up to say, "This is not a secret about box. We apologize for the confusion." You could also get cartoons of the development team by dragging appropriately named files into the preview window, such as Secret About Cable, which gets you this picture of Cable Sasser. There's a great one in Airfoil by Rogue Amoeba. Hold down Option when selecting About Airfoil, and you get an old-school text adventure game where you try to obtain an Apple employee badge, break into Infinite Loop, and steal some very specific corporate secrets. Delicious Library, which is a media management app, would whisper the word Voldemort 7 seconds after you scanned a copy of any Harry Potter book or DVD, freaking out many people in the process. The text editor BBEdit, an app that I've been using for over 27 years, adds the current user's full name into the About screen under the section Unindicted Co-Conspirators. For a long, long time, I just assumed that Rich Siegel valued our friendship and had added me to the About screen. And I was suitably touched at this gesture, and I found out that was not the case. Now, I did finally get my name in an Apple product in macOS 9 in 1999. I wasn't part of the Sherlock 2 team, but I'd done some very last-minute work for them, and I added brushed metal appearance to the app the weekend before the Macworld keynote where macOS 9 was introduced. Let's just say it was something to do with Steve Jobs. And I got it done just in time, and Sherlock 2 indeed made the keynote. As a thank you, I was added into the About window, which remains my sole credit in an Apple product. What I was actually working on at the time was the macOS 10 dock and Finder, or the Millennium Finder, as it was known internally. Of course, this Finder was going to have its own secret about box with a list of credits. I reworked the existing code from the macOS 9 Finder, and it was all ready to go with my name in it, finally. I just see my name might just come up there. And the next week, Steve ordered that all credits were to be stripped from the operating system. And indeed, I didn't particularly feel great about that. Arno Gurdal's business card read About Box Engineer in the late 90s when the ban came into effect. He did do a lot more than that, I should say. And I asked him what he remembered of this decision. Steve made that call. He appreciated the creativity in them and recognizing people, but he gave us two arguments. One, we should apply that creativity and effort into features that end users would actually benefit from. Two, and he'd actually thought about this quite a bit, there were lots of people who were not in the About Box that had contributed as well. You know, the chefs at Apple's cafe, the janitorial staff, the lawyers, the accountants, the people in logistics or tech support. And it wasn't right for them to be second-class citizens. So he thought it would be best if the software was brought to you by Apple and all the people behind it. I could see this point because I always struggled with who to include and not wanting to leave anybody out, so that made sense. A third reason I heard about, but that Steve didn't mention, is that he was also worried that people were using the secret About Box to poach engineers from Apple. And this was before LinkedIn. I don't know if that ever happened, but there you go. Now, to me, this sounded a lot like the arguments from Atari 2 decades earlier. In 2001, the original iPod came with a breakout egg as well. In the first version of the firmware, if you held down the center button for a few seconds in the About section, you got breakout. And I asked Greg Marriott about it, who was the iPod software lead at the time. And he said, quite a few of the iPod engineers and managers were old school Mac programmers. I wanted to have an Easter egg in iPod. iPod was Steve's pet project, and I was too scared to put something in that he didn't know about. I needed the Easter egg to be compelling and something that I could show to Steve, and he would say yes. After some discussion, I thought Breakout would be a wonderful candidate. The wheel was a great input device for it, and Steve and Woz's involvement in creating the original arcade game made it likely to be approved. Mike Neal at Pixo, the software that drove the UI for iPod, implemented the game. Then it came time to demo. At the end of the meeting, I said I had one more thing. The smile on Steve's face is a memory I treasure. He approved. In a subsequent release, he wanted us to make it an actual feature. That opened the door for other games on iPod later on. And I think this was the last full Easter egg that Apple ever shipped. I also spoke to Steven Sinofsky, former president of the Windows division at Microsoft. Referring to this game that was hidden in Microsoft Word in Office in 2000, he said, I did once have to explain Space Invaders to a bunch of Navy brass at the Naval School in Monterey. That was the last Easter egg we ever had. Just because Apple and Microsoft were out of the Easter egg game didn't mean it was all over by any means. For example, Ratchet & Clank 2 by Insomniac Games was released for the PlayStation 2 in 2003. It had a hidden museum level where you could play around in various debug rooms and hear from the developers themselves about stuff that they cut from the game. As the company name might imply, you got into the museum by standing on top of a fountain at a certain point in the game at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is probably my favorite Easter egg of all time, and it was definitely another early influence on P Calc's About screen. As it happened, my own time at Apple was destined to be a lot shorter than I had anticipated. And I think this slide is pretty self-explanatory. Anyway, after I'd moved back to Scotland and decided to go indie again, I kept adding small Easter eggs to my own apps. In 2009, in P Calc, I made what was intended to be a satirical comment on app review, where the display would censor any rude calculator words that you entered and you turned your phone upside down. Let me tell you, that went super well. In the spring of 2017, I added a few alternative icons that you could pick for the app, which started me down a dark path. Just a few. It was a nice creative outlet at a difficult time, and this was really the beginning of the end, though, because instead of telling me to stop, people kept encouraging me. I added a tip jar at the same time, and the tips that unlocked these icons bought me an iMac Pro. While I was creating the icons, I started messing around with 3D models of them, first in Photoshop, and then I learned how to build things using Blender and export them to the 3D formats that Apple supported natively in the OS. Which then led to a 3D model of the icon in the About screen that you could move around like my favorite iguana flag. And I was using SceneKit to do the hard work, and I also had a physics engine, so I played around with dropping a variety of objects onto the icon as you do. And I eventually settled on bananas because they had the best shape for generating the most interesting bounces. I ported the code, or at least some key banana-based aspects, to the Apple Watch, which was an experiment in optimizing the graphics for running on a significantly lower spec device, which in turn led to the main iOS and Mac code running faster, as I then understood more about where the performance trade-offs were. And it was then really just a short leap to exploring the ARKit stuff and creating an augmented reality version of P Calc that actually worked. And it does look like AR might be something that Apple is going to do a lot more of in the future, so this knowledge may well be of use. Then I discovered the SceneKit APIs for creating vehicles, and it was pretty clear to me what I needed to do. And I tried multiple times over the last 25 years to write some kind of game, and I'd always given up halfway through, but not this time. I started with some basic jumps to try out the car physics. Then I expanded that out to a little city you could drive around in and added 100 golden bananas to collect. Now, I'm not saying I'm exactly Nintendo here, but it did give me a small glimpse into how these things are made. And it turns out that writing games is much like writing any other code, and it's actually a lot of fun. It is a terrible way to make a living, however. Although, having said that, I just spent the last few weeks making a dice rolling app for playing D&D with, using P Calc About screen technology. And it's actually been doing pretty well. So it does have its own Easter eggs, but no About screen as yet. And yeah, I now realize I did credit it to just P Calc, much like Apple and Atari did, but anyway. But now we've come full circle. So why did I do this? There was certainly a great deal of unchecked ego about wanting to build the best secret About box ever, as well as emulating my old heroes, from the video games of my youth to the Apple engineers after that. There was also missing out on my About box fame from the Finder, boredom about working on the same calculator day after day, and honestly, some depression at the state of the world and wanting an escape from the 24-hour news cycle. But I think it comes down to constantly challenging yourself to learn new things, keeping your skills sharp, unleashing your inner creativity and happiness and actually having fun. And these are all excellent goals and should be encouraged wherever possible. My lawyer says, however, don't do anything without your manager's explicit knowledge and permission. But equally, if you are that manager, give all your employees credit for the work that they do. Anyway, that's me done talking now. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. But there's just one more thing that I'd like to do, and I'm going to sit down for this. And that's to roll the credits. I'd like to point out that these are current credits for the Finder. And I got my name in. There goes Herman. Thank you.